Wonderful panel to cover these topics with you. We are all members of the Horace Mann League. Horace Mann was a great educator and a first-rate politician who's credited with being the father of the American public school. He thought of public schools as the great balance wheel of society, the greatest invention of mankind. And every time I say the great balance wheel of society, you will hear boom, 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 as Microsoft chips in. The Horace Mann League is dedicated to perpetuating Horace Mann's ideal, oddly enough, and we'll be talking about some of those as we go along. Jack McKay is our excellent executive director. Stand up, Jack, so everyone can see you. He's here with us today, and any one of us will be happy to talk to you about the Horace Mann League, joining the Horace Mann League. We can talk to Jack about that too. So let me introduce the members of our panel, and then we can sort of get underway. I'm James Harvey, as I said. In the center here, on the far right, we have Martha Bruckner from Council Bluffs, Iowa, Superintendent of Council Bluffs, Iowa. Evelyn Holman, sitting beside her, Superintendent in Bay Shore, New York. And to my immediate right is Gary Marx, who's the president of the Center for Public Outreach in Fairfax, Virginia. I'd like to set the stage with just a couple of remarks, and then we can get to the panelists who will have much more interesting things to say to you than I do. We've really been here before. This is an age-old argument that goes back at least to the Articles of Confederacy, before the United States was founded, about the scale and scope and size and powers of government generally, but particularly the federal government. But you have to date this somewhere. And what we're looking at is an era of privatization that's really been the result of 50 years of work that started in about 1951. It's global. It involves all public services, and it's all over the world. What we're seeing here with respect to American education is universal. It's well planned and it's not accidental. And the goal is a small state, market-centered society in which the poor basically are left to shift for themselves. As I said, we've had this discussion for a long time, but you have to date it at some point, and 1951 is as good a time to date it as another, when Milton Friedman, an economist at the University of Chicago, called for vouchers to privatize public education. We've had this really 50 years of effort to shrink the state, and it's not, as I said earlier, focused only on schools. You shouldn't take it personally, although it's hard not to take it personally. It's global, it's very well planned, and it takes in public service across the board. The problem I had with this particular slide was paring it down to 5 or 6 things that could fit on a slide. I could have given you dozens of examples. Albert Shanker was a former president of the American Federation of Teachers. He liked to tell a story about the frog that was placed in a pot of cold water. You've all heard this story, I'm sure. And the frog's very comfortable in the pot of cold water, which is then put on a flame to boil. And as the flame gets warmer, the frog sort of sets into it. And by the time the pot of water is boiling, the frog, of course, is cooked. And I think we've been like that frog over the last 50 years. And the water is very close to the boil now. And I don't think we're quite cooked, but things are getting pretty hot. I want you to remember this name, Grover Norquist. He's on the bottom of the slide, the second one up from the bottom, because I'm going to come back to him. He founded Americans for Tax Reform in 1984 at the specific request of President Ronald Reagan. And his goal was quite explicit. Norquist wanted to starve the beast, and the beast was the federal government. So the means of starving the beast was to cut down the taxation level that the beast depended upon, so that government really wouldn't be able to perform its appointed services. The quote from Ronald Reagan, I think, is very interesting. This was during the 1980 campaign. I remember him saying this at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia during the campaign. Government's not the solution to our problem. Government is our problem. And that's a direct reverse of what Franklin Roosevelt had convinced Americans of in the 1930s. He came to power, to the presidency, in the midst of a national crisis. He persuaded the middle class to sympathize with the poor on the grounds that the middle class might very well be poor before they knew it. He said that Wall Street was the problem and government was the solution. And of course, Reagan reversed all of that. He came to power in the middle of a crisis. He persuaded the middle class to identify with the wealthy on the ground that we could all be wealthy. And he said what he said here: government's not the problem. Government's not the solution. It's the problem. The solution lies in the private sector. So that what we have is really the Californification, I think of it as, of government at all levels. In 1978, California passed Proposition 13. In this state, it takes a 2/3 majority of the legislature to increase any tax, but a simple majority can be rallied in elections to turn down any tax. We have the same thing going on in the state of Washington, where I live, and it makes it very, very difficult for government to function in that environment, where essentially a minority can prevent tax increases, and a majority can prevent tax increases, and a majority isn't sufficient to raise taxes. And that's why the California budget has been tied up in knots for the last 5 years, because the politics of it, as you can imagine, simply don't work out. It's global, as I said earlier. If you were watching the news this morning, you saw that there was a demonstration in London of 300,000 people protesting the government's cuts there. In England, they're cutting health care, they're creating foundation schools, which are charter schools, they're cutting higher education, they're cutting the post office. I lived in England as a boy, and despite what you hear here in the United States, the English healthcare system is a model of government efficiency. It's gotten better in the last couple of years. In the United States, we see these efforts towards charter schools, vouchers, corrections has been privatized, the Defense Department has been privatized with contractors, higher education, more and more public sector relies on tuition as opposed to state aid, and of course the Postal Service has been privatized for about 25 years. In Asia in the 1990s, they transferred public water systems to private hands, and in Latin America throughout the 1990s also there were riots everywhere about the transfer of public institutions to the private sector. I said it was well planned and not accidental, and here's our friend Norquist again. He's been pushing this agenda of low taxation and deregulation for about 30 years at meetings that he schedules in Washington, D.C. with other people who share his outlook, literally on a weekly basis. I think they're called the Wednesday morning breakfast. He now has affiliates of this organization, Americans for Tax Return, in some 48 states, and they're doing the same sort of weekly meetings in these states. The Koch brothers have recently joined them. They're lifelong libertarians who believe in minimal social services to the needy, according to a recent profile in the New York Times. And they were emboldened in part in the last couple of years by the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision. And if you haven't heard of that, that's a decision that overturned the McCain-Feingold campaign financing legislation. And the Supreme Court now permits corporations to pour unlimited amounts of money into campaigns as long as the campaigns aren't associated with any particular candidate. So the Koch brothers took advantage of that to essentially establish and create the Tea Party last year and get it active across the country. So the current status of this is that public schools are under attack, charters and vouchers are promoted, collective bargaining is under assault, performance assessment is seen as the latest silver bullet reform, and markets and competition are glorified, and licensure laws for both teachers and administrators are belittled. And this agenda, in some way, shape, or form, has taken shape in many, many states across the country and at the national level. Many states have adopted at least some parts of it. Some states have adopted this entire list. And in fact, I got this list just by looking on the internet the other day, and this is the governor's proposals in the state of Ohio just in the last 2 weeks. So, our panel's agenda, after sort of giving you this introduction, is that Martha is going to talk about the growth of charters and vouchers. Evelyn is going to talk about effectiveness research on charters. Gary here is going to look to the future. And then I'm going to do some wrap-up, and then we'll have some audience question and answer. And I want to assure you that I hope I haven't depressed you too much, because we have answers for all of this. But we need to understand where we are before we can understand what we need to do about it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Martha.
very much. This seemed like an exercise for me when we